Imagine the following situation. Two daughters, feeling helpless and without any prospects for the future, in an act of desperation, decide to get their own father drunk in order to have sex with him on the first night. The eldest daughter fulfills the plan by sleeping with her father while he is drunk and unaware of what happens the next day. The youngest daughter, following the same plan, also sleeps with her father after getting drunk again, ensuring that both of them conceive children. From this incestuous union, one of the most conflicted peoples in the Bible was born. However, this nation would be of extreme importance to the lineage of Jesus Christ. It seems confusing, but I will explain this whole story according to what is written in the Bible. Sit back and click the like button, and let's go to the video. The story of the Moabites begins with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, described in Genesis 18. God revealed to Abraham that he intended to destroy these cities due to their extreme wickedness. Concerned for his nephew Lot, who was living in Sodom, Abraham interceded and asked if God would spare the cities if there were at least 10 righteous people in them. God agreed, but the reality was that there were not that many righteous people. 2 angels were sent to Sodom to save Lot and his family. They met Lot at the entrance to the city, and he welcomed them into his home. That night, the men of Sodom surrounded the residents, demanding that Lot hand over the visitors so they could abuse them. In a desperate act of hospitality, Lot offered his own daughters in place of the angels, but the men of Sodom refused. The angels then blinded the attackers and instructed Lot to gather his family and leave the city immediately, for destruction was near. At dawn, they hurried Lot, his wife, and his daughters to flee quickly, with the clear order not to look back. However, during their escape, Lot's wife disobeyed, looked back, and was turned into a pillar of salt, evidencing the seriousness of God's instructions. In Genesis 19:26, it is written, "Then the Lord rained sulfur and fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah." God completely destroyed the cities, as well as the entire plain, its inhabitants, and its vegetation. Lot and his daughters took refuge in the mountains, as instructed by the angels, witnessing the total devastation that befell Sodom and Gomorrah, a clear manifestation of God's judgment against wickedness. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were consumed by fire and sulfur, leaving behind a desolate landscape and serving as an eternal example of God's justice. After taking refuge in the mountains, Lot and his daughters faced a new challenge: survival in an isolated and resourceless environment. Lot's daughters, believing that the devastation they had witnessed was total, feared that there would be no men left to continue the family line. In those days, preserving one's name and family was crucial, and the extinction of a lineage was seen as a tragedy. Faced with the apparent annihilation of their community and with no prospect of finding other men, Lot's daughters took an extreme and desperate step. They believed that the only way to ensure the continuity of their family was through their own father. So they got Lot drunk so that he would not be aware of their actions. On the first night, the older daughter gave Lot wine and lay with him. The next night, the younger daughter repeated the act. Both became pregnant and gave birth to 2 sons, Moab, who would become the progenitor of the Moabites, and Ben-Ami, who would be the ancestor of the Ammonites. This controversial origin marked the Moabites with difficulties from the beginning, and these characteristics would accompany them throughout their history. Comparing the Moabites to the Ammonites, there are some notable similarities and differences. Both peoples descended from Lot, but the Moabites descended from the eldest daughter, while the Ammonites descended from the youngest daughter. This shared origin created a complex relationship between the 2 peoples, which was often reflected in their interactions with the Israelites. The Bible describes these origins in Genesis 19:37-38, which reports, "The firstborn bore a son, and named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. And the younger also bore a son, and named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day." The name Moab carries with it an interesting and even ironic meaning, as its etymology suggests, "from my father," a direct reference to their incestuous origin. This linguistic connection highlights the troubled beginnings of the Moabites and marks them with a stigma that permeates their history. Geographically, the Moabites occupied a territory east of the Dead Sea, in a region that today corresponds to Jordan. Their prosperity was closely linked to their agricultural and pastoral economy, since they were located in a fertile area. Moab's fertile lands allowed the Moabites to grow wheat, barley, and grapes, as well as raise sheep and goats. Agriculture was the backbone of Moab's economy, complemented by the trade of its products with neighboring peoples. Moabite society was organized hierarchically, with local leaders who answered to a central king, ensuring efficient administration and protection against invaders. This solid socioeconomic structure allowed Moab to be a prosperous and resilient nation, reflecting the wealth of its lands and the skill of its people in utilizing them. In the religious realm, the Moabites were devoted to Chemosh, a god associated with fertility and war. The worship of Chemosh played a central role in the lives of the Moabites, and their rituals often included human sacrifices aimed at obtaining blessings and protection. The Bible offers a grim account of this worship in the second book of Kings, chapter 3, where the king of Moab, in a desperate act, sacrificed his own son to Chemosh during a battle. This dramatic episode occurred during the reign of Joram, king of Israel, when the Moabites rebelled against Israelite rule following the death of King Ahab. Upon ascending the throne, Joram discovered that Mesha, the king of Moab, had rebelled, refusing to pay the annual tribute of wool. In response, Joram formed an alliance with Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and the king of Edom to suppress the revolt. Together, they marched against Moab, facing a challenging journey through the desert of Edom. The expedition faced difficulties early on, as the allied armies suffered from a lack of water. Desperate, they consulted the prophet Elisha, who assured them that God would provide water and deliver Moab into their hands. Elisha prophesied that the dry valleys would be filled with water without rain or wind, which indeed happened, allowing the armies to continue their march revitalized. Upon reaching the Moabite territory, the Allied armies encountered resistance but achieved significant victories, destroying cities and devastating fields. The Moabites, realizing the gravity of the situation, retreated to the fortified city of Kir-Hareseth, where Mesha made his last stand. With the city besieged and defeat imminent, Mesha took a desperate measure to seek help from his god Chemosh. Before the walls of the city, in full view of everyone, he sacrificed his firstborn son, who was to succeed him on the throne. This extreme act was an attempt to invoke divine assistance to reverse the dire situation. The Bible describes this event in 2 Kings 3, highlighting Mesha's desperation and his quest for a miracle to save his kingdom. In 2 Kings 3 verse 27 we read, "Then he took his firstborn son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel, and they withdrew and returned to their own land." This sacrifice had a profound impact. The allies of Israel, horrified and perhaps fearing divine retribution or the psychological effect of the sacrifice, lifted the siege and returned to their lands. The narrative suggests that Mesha's desperate action, despite its brutality, managed to deter the enemy armies, temporarily saving Moab from complete destruction. Mesha's sacrifice reveals the intensity of the conflict and the deep desperation of the Moabites in the face of impending defeat. These acts, though cruel by modern standards, were viewed in that time as essential for securing prosperity and military victory. They highlight the strong connection between religion and daily life in Moabite culture, where religion shaped not only spiritual life, but also social and political norms. The worship of Chemosh profoundly influenced the decisions of the king and local leaders, permeating all aspects of Moabite society. Religious festivals and rituals were important communal moments, reinforcing the identity and cohesion of the people. Moreover, the worship of Chemosh reflected a spiritual hierarchy that mirrored the political structure, with the king acting as an intermediary between the people and the divine, ensuring that the will of the god was fulfilled. The cultural influence of the Moabites extended beyond their borders, affecting neighboring peoples, including Israel. The relationship between Moabites and Israelites was complex, marked by both periods of conflict and cooperation. In some biblical passages, the Moabites appear as fierce enemies, while in others, they are temporary allies. This dynamic reflects the rich culture of Moab and its ability to adapt and interact with other nations, even amid tensions. The rituals and sacrifices of the Moabites were viewed with horror by the Israelites, and their religious practices often led to conflicts. In Numbers 25, we read about how the Moabites seduced the Israelites into participating in their idolatrous rituals, resulting in a plague sent by God as punishment. The narrative describes the Israelites engaging in acts of sexual immorality with Moabite women, who deliberately lured Israelite men not only into illicit relationships, but also into participating in sacrifices to Moabite gods. The clear objective of this seduction was to divert the Israelites from their fidelity to God, introducing them to the worship of Baal Peor, a local deity associated with fertility and sexuality. In Numbers 25 of 1-2, we read, "While Israel was staying in Shittim, the people began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate and bowed down before these gods." This involvement in idolatrous rituals included not just acts of worship, but also ritualistic sexual practices common in pagan religions of the time. God's anger was kindled against Israel due to their infidelity and violation of the covenant. In response, God commanded Moses to have the leaders of the people who had engaged in idol worship executed, and for the offenders to be hanged in full view, so that his wrath might be turned away from Israel. Moses conveyed this command to the judges of Israel, who began to carry out the sentences. The situation escalated when Zimri, an Israelite man, brought a Midianite woman, Cosbi, into his tent in a blatant act of disobedience and disrespect, visible to Moses and the entire congregation. While the people lamented at the entrance of the tent of meeting, crying over the plague sent by God, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar and grandson of High Priest Aaron, witnessed the scene. Filled with intense zeal for God's honor, he took a spear, entered the tent, and killed Zimri and Cosbi with a single thrust. This fervent act of zeal appeased God's anger and halted the plague, which had already claimed the lives of 24,000 Israelites. In recognition, God praised Phinehas for his actions and established with him a covenant of peace, granting him and his descendants a perpetual priesthood. In Numbers 25:10-13 it says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites, since he was as zealous for my honor among them as I am. I did not put an end to them in my zeal. Therefore tell him I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites.'" This episode highlights the ongoing tension between nations, where religion played a central role. During the Exodus, for example, the Moabites, led by Balak, viewed the Israelites as a threat. The story begins with Balak, the king of Moab, fearing the power of the Israelites, who were camped in the plains of Moab near the Jordan River after defeating the Amorites. Terrified, Balak feared that Moab would be destroyed, just like other peoples. To address this threat, he sought Balaam, a prophet known for his blessings and curses, sending messengers with valuable gifts in an attempt to persuade him to curse Israel. However, upon consulting God, Balaam received a clear response. "Do not go with them. You must not put a curse on those people, because they are blessed." Numbers 22:12. Despite this divine instruction, Balak persisted and continued to send messengers. Even more distinguished messengers with more tempting offers were sent to Balaam, who, eager for material gain, asked them to stay while he sought a new answer from God. The Lord allowed Balaam to go, but with the strict condition that he only speak what God commanded. Balaam set out with the Moabite envoys, but his journey was interrupted by a remarkable event. The angel of the Lord appeared on the path to block his way. Although Balaam could not see the angel, his donkey perceived the celestial figure with a drawn sword and turned aside. In this famous passage, the donkey spoke to Balaam after being beaten. When the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, he saw the angel and fell down in fear. The angel of the Lord reiterated that Balaam should speak only what God commanded, and thus he continued his journey, now more aware of the commitment he had made. Upon arriving in Moab, Balak took Balaam to various high places from where he could view the Israelite camp. At each of these sites, Balak hoped that Balaam would curse Israel, but instead, God placed words of blessing in Balaam's mouth. Repeatedly, Balaam proclaimed powerful blessings over Israel, prophesying its growth and prosperity. In Numbers 24:5-7, he declared, "How beautiful are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel. Like valleys they spread out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Water will flow from their buckets, and their seed will have abundant water. Your king will be exalted more than Agag, and his kingdom will be exalted." Frustrated and furious, Balak changed locations several times in hopes of obtaining a curse, but all attempts were in vain. Finally, disillusioned, Balak dismissed Balaam. However, before leaving, Balaam pronounced one last prophecy, predicting the ultimate defeat of Israel's enemies in the future messianic reign. In Numbers 24:17, he prophesied, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob, and a scepter will rise out of Israel. It will crush the foreheads of Moab and the skulls of all the sons of Sheth." Yet, the conclusion of Balaam's story carries a darker tone. Although he obeyed God by not directly cursing Israel, he later advised the Moabites on how to lead the Israelites into idolatry and immorality. For this betrayal, Balaam met his end during Israel's vengeance against the Midianites. The Moabites, although often depicted as enemies of Israel, play a crucial role in the biblical narrative, especially through the story of Ruth. This narrative unfolds during the period of the Judges, a time of great instability in Israel. The story begins with a family from Bethlehem, consisting of Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Due to a severe famine in Bethlehem, the family decided to emigrate to the land of Moab in search of better conditions. Once settled in Moab, Naomi's two sons married Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. However, tragedy struck the family. First, Elimelech passed away, followed by the deaths of both sons, leaving Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah destitute. Desolate, upon hearing that the Lord had provided food in Israel, Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem. She urged her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab and seek new husbands, as she could not offer them more sons to marry. Although Orpah reluctantly followed her advice and returned to her family, Ruth demonstrated extraordinary loyalty. In Ruth 1:16-17, she declared, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." With this display of devotion, Ruth accompanied Naomi back to Bethlehem. The arrival of Naomi, now a widow and impoverished, caused a great stir in the city. She requested to be called Mara, meaning bitter, for she felt that the Lord had dealt harshly with her. The Lord had made Naomi's life bitter, and to survive, Ruth began working in the fields during the barley harvest. She followed the harvesters, picking up the leftover stalks, a practice known as gleaning, permitted by Israelite law to benefit the poor and foreigners. By divine providence, Ruth ended up working in the fields of Boaz, a wealthy relative of Elimelech. Boaz noticed Ruth and, impressed by her loyalty to Naomi, ensured her protection and provision, instructing his servants to leave extra stalks for her. He also praised her for seeking refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. Ruth 2:12. Upon hearing of Boaz's kindness, Naomi recognized an opportunity for redemption for both Ruth and herself. She advised Ruth to approach Boaz humbly, following the customs of levirate marriage and property redemption. Ruth followed Naomi's advice and went to Boaz at the threshing floor, where he was sleeping after winnowing the grain. She uncovered his feet and lay down, a symbolic gesture asking for protection and proposing marriage. Boaz was surprised, but honored by Ruth's actions, praising her virtue. However, he informed her that there was a closer relative who had the first right to redeem the property and marry Ruth. Nevertheless, Boaz promised to resolve the matter justly. The next day, Boaz gathered the town elders and the closer relative to discuss the case. The relative initially accepted the responsibility, but upon learning he would need to marry Ruth, a Moabite, he backed away, fearing it would jeopardize his own inheritance. Consequently, Boaz took on the responsibility of redeeming the land and marrying Ruth. The elders and the people of Bethlehem blessed the union, wishing that Ruth would be like Rachel and Leah, who built up the house of Israel. Boaz married Ruth, and the Lord blessed them with a son, Obed, who became the father of Jesse, the grandfather of King David. Thus, Ruth, the Moabite, entered the lineage of David and eventually into the genealogy of Jesus Christ, as recorded in Matthew 5-6. The story of Ruth concludes by celebrating her loyalty and divine providence, illustrating how God transforms tragedies into blessings, and how faith and devotion can open paths to a future of hope and redemption. After a long period of prosperity, Moab experienced a sharp decline, marked by a series of adverse events. The prophecies concerning Moab, found in the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah, provide a detailed view of divine judgment upon this nation. Isaiah 15:1 vividly describes the fall of Moab, portraying devastation and suffering. Once prosperous cities lie in ruins, and their inhabitants flee in despair. Isaiah 16:6-7 highlights Moab's arrogance as one of the reasons for its judgment. We have heard of the pride of Moab, how arrogant he is, of his haughtiness, his pride, and his fury, but his lies will not be so. These words echo God's justice, which does not tolerate pride and idolatry. The prophet Jeremiah also pronounces severe judgments against Moab. In Jeremiah 48, the prophet details the impending destruction that would come upon Moab due to its reliance on its own works and wealth, as well as its idolatry. Jeremiah 48:42-44 states, "Moab will be destroyed. It will cease to be a people, because it has exalted itself against the Lord. Terror, pit, and snare await you, O inhabitant of Moab." Jeremiah's prophecies emphasize that divine judgment is inevitable for those who stray from God, surrendering themselves to idolatry and pride. This chapter serves as a strong warning and a reflection on the consequences of turning away from divine paths. The sovereignty of God and the necessity of humility and obedience are central to the judgment of Moab, with reasons that include idolatry, pride, and the oppression of Israel. The prophecies not only anticipate Moab's downfall, but also function as a universal alert for all nations, highlighting the importance of remaining faithful to God. The Bible makes it clear that actions have consequences, and Moab, in its arrogance and worship of false gods, provoked divine wrath. The judgments of Isaiah and Jeremiah reinforce the idea that God, in his justice, does not overlook injustice and idolatry. In addition to the prophecies of destruction, there is also a glimpse of hope and restoration. In Jeremiah 48:47, God promises to restore Moab's fortunes in the last days. "But I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days, says the Lord." This promise of restoration demonstrates divine mercy and God's willingness to forgive those who repent. Even in the midst of severe judgment, there is a light of hope, reminding us that divine compassion is always available to those who seek redemption. The invasion of foreign armies, such as the Assyrians and Babylonians, further aggravated the situation in Moab, resulting in the loss of territories and its autonomy. The Babylonians, known for their military strength and relentless strategies, marched against Moab, destroying its cities and subjugating its people. This military campaign, described in both biblical and historical sources, led to the near-total destruction of Moab as an independent political entity. Its cities were looted, its fields devastated, and its population either exiled or killed. The fall of Moab, as prophesied, indeed occurred, demonstrating the truth of the prophet's words. The ruins of ancient Moabite cities stand as a silent testament to the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. This fulfillment not only validates the authenticity of the scriptures, but also reinforces the message that God is sovereign over all nations. The story of Moab, from its heights to its fall, powerfully illustrates divine justice and the importance of living in accordance with God's precepts. Exploring the prophecies and judgment of Moab leads us to a deep reflection on our own relationship with God and the nations around us. The lessons drawn from these ancient stories are timeless, reminding us of the importance of humility, obedience, and faithfulness. As we consider the lessons from the history of the Moabites, we understand how these events shape our perception of divine justice and mercy, and how these truths can be applied to our lives today. The history of the Moabites offers a powerful mirror for us to reflect on the impact of our actions and choices. By analyzing the decisions we make daily, we can learn from the mistakes and successes of this ancient people. The Moabites, in their arrogance and idolatry, often strayed from God's paths, and the consequences were severe. This narrative teaches us that our actions can indeed determine the future of the generations that follow us. The Bible is full of examples that show how obedience and disobedience to God can shape our destiny, constantly reminding us of the importance of living according to His principles. One of the most significant lessons we can draw from the history of the Moabites is the importance of the legacy we leave behind. Our choices can impact much more than just our lives. They influence our descendants and the society around us. The Bible calls us to seriously reflect on how we live and how our actions reflect God's will. In Deuteronomy 30:19, we read, "Choose life, so that you and your children may live." This passage highlights the responsibility we have in our daily choices and the power they hold to shape the future. Applying these lessons is essential for any Christian seeking to live according to biblical teachings. We must ask ourselves, are we living in a way that honors God and leaves a positive legacy for future generations? The message we can draw from the story of the Moabites is one of warning and hope. It serves as a warning to those who stray from God's paths, as the consequences are inevitable and severe. Yet, there is also hope, for just as God promised to restore Moab in the last days, He offers restoration and forgiveness to all who repent and return to Him. This duality between judgment and mercy is a central theme in the Bible and should motivate us to seek a deeper and more sincere relationship with God. Ultimately, the Bible, as an inexhaustible source of wisdom and guidance, provides us with all the tools necessary to live a life that glorifies God. By learning from the past, we can shape a more promising future for ourselves and for generations to come.